Hey everyone, I'm Brandon Williams. I'm a systems engineer at Ramsey Solutions. This talk is titled, Let's Choose Kaizen Instead of the Rewrite. If I could go back and do it over again and rewrite my talk, I would have titled it, The Rewrite's the Right Way. So, let's get started. The story. How many of you have joined a new team? I expect everybody's hands to go up. And of those people, have you come into a team and there's been lots and lots of code there already? Raise your hand. Yes, all right, perfect. So this talk is for you then. So I joined a new team, and about 18 months ago at Ramsey Solutions, there were thousands and thousands of lines of code. And you're optimistic when you join that team. You're thinking, I'm going to come in, I'm going to make an impact on this code base. Everything's going to be awesome. You know, you go through the honeymoon phase, you get to the end of that honeymoon phase, and you realize, wow, everything is broken. But maybe not necessarily broken. It's just, it feels broken because you just start to realize all the warts of all the decisions that were made over time. So let's start with the story. So we had a lot of build scripts, and those build scripts were written in Python. Regardless of what they're written in, this is the story for our team. And we had this particular build script, and we wanted to add a new feature to it. We wanted to rewrite it. So what are the options for that new build script? It was complete. There was no tests on any of our code base, thousands and thousands of lines of code. We wanted to do it the right way, right? So we chose the rewrite. And why do we choose the rewrites? Joel Spolsky, the Joel test, he said back in 2000, why do we choose rewrites? And he said it's because it's easier to write code than it is to read it. It's really hard to read the code and to keep in your head all the different things that are going on. So a lot of times as developers, we like to rewrite the application. So we decided we were going to do this rewrite of one of our build scripts that builds our Ruby on Rails applications. That build script, we thought, that should be pretty easy. We'll do it in a day, right? 1 week later, we had it done. And this was just a simple one-file build script for building Ruby applications, and it took us a week. So we did it the right way, right? Our rewrite we did the right way. We test drove the build script. We made sure we ported all the requirements over, everything. So it took us a week, and when we thought it'd take us a day, we implemented that, and then for 2 weeks, we were cleaning up all the bugs of the features that we missed or the things that we changed because we were like, oh, we don't need to do that anymore. That's old and that's deprecated. That's a bug. So we changed it in the new one. And like I said, we did it the right way. We test drove this script. So everything was, it felt like we were doing it the right way. But we spent 2 weeks cleaning up our own mess. So if rewrite's not the right way, what is? Kaizen. So Kaizen, is that a type of role? No, it's not a type of role. Kaizen is a Japanese business philosophy of continuous improvement, working practices, personal efficiency. So Kaizen I've heard a lot on my business podcast that I listen to, and it's very, it's in the business community that a lot of people know about it in regards to business processes. So people talk about Kaizen and that continuous improvement. Kaizen literally means in Japanese improvement. So working on improving that. How can we apply Kaizen to us as developers? Well, let's look at it in terms of code quality. So let's use words that the business people know. So let's start, instead of saying, we need to refactor this or we need to rewrite this, let's say, let's choose Kaizen. Let's implement that. Let's make it just a little bit better. Talking about refactoring is, we'll talk about refactoring here in a little bit. But Kaizen, the idea, if you take nothing away from this talk, take away this one phrase, Kaizen, I'm going to make this code 1% better today. So don't try and make it 100% better. Don't try and make it 20% better. Let's work on just making it 1% better today. Kind of the Boy Scout rule. You go in and you leave it better than what you found it. So if you continue to make these 1% improvements day over day, after time, you're going to end up with a 10%, a 20%, eventually 100% improvement as you continue to make these 1% improvements. Just go in there and make a very small change, make 1% improvement, and then it'll make your code a lot better overall. So we talked about the rewrite, and we don't want to do that anymore. So just throw away that old build script, rewrite it. Even though we were doing test-driven development and everything, we still missed stuff because there is so much. There's so many things in there that you don't realize. Just years and years of accumulation of this requirement and this requirement. So if we're not going to do a full rewrite, even though we're doing it the right way with test-driven development, what is that next? What's the other option? So Kaizen, and I've defined these 3 different steps that you can kind of follow. So Kaizen, to me, means this 3-step process, and this can be applied at all different levels of your code. It can be applied at the function level, so at a single method or a single function. It can be applied at the script level, like what we're doing. It can be applied at the application level, or it can even be applied at the infrastructure level. So we're going to drill down into each one of these steps here. So code jail. What is code jail? It is locking up a piece of code until its boundaries are established. So you take your production code and you put it away. You say, this is what it is, and we're not going to change it. Now, a small caveat here, our build script that we're going to talk about. So the Ruby build script that we had didn't go so well. And we had a lot of missed requirements. It took us longer than we initially thought. So we said it should take us a day to implement or to rewrite and implement. It took us 3 weeks. So we didn't want to repeat that. So we take this concept of code jail and we implement it against our other build scripts. So we have Java projects and we have Ruby projects. And our Java projects hadn't been. We needed to do the same thing that we did for the Ruby projects with the Java projects, where we were rewriting them or building these applications as Docker images and deploying them. So we had already done that with the Ruby ones, and now we needed to do it for the Java projects. So we took it and we put our Java build script in code jail. And we said, okay, can't touch this code until we get it under control. So we took all the code in the Python script and threw it into one single function so that we could easily test it. So then the next step in Kaizen is your characterization tests. You start to write tests around the code to capture how it currently functions. Right or wrong, you are only capturing what it currently does. You don't change that code at all. Michael Feathers coined this phrase, the characterization test. So you're just saying, this is how the system functions. Like I said, right or wrong, and we're not changing any production code, regardless of whether or not you find a bug in the system. That bug may not be intentional, but it may have impact on the code, especially if it's a top-down script. So at this point, the only new code we're writing for our build script is that test code. Finally, we get to, after we've written these characterization tests to say, hey, this is how it currently operates, this is all the requirements that we've defined for it, then we get to go in and finally make changes, and which is either a refactor or a new feature. That new feature could be a bug fix. It could be an additional thing onto that build script or that application, whatever it is. So refactor. Martin Fowler defined that as refactoring is a disciplined technique for restructuring an existing body of code, altering its internal structure without changing external behavior. So at this point, all we're doing is just changing the internals of that code and not changing its external behavior. So we're just improving the health of the code. Again, notice the word there, improving. So back to the Kaizen, the continuous improvement. We're just looking to improve our code at this point. The other changes that we can make are adding these new features. So after we've defined the characterization tests, we can either change the test that exists to say, hey, this is a bug. Let's change that test to say it should act this way now. And then we can fix the production code. Or we can write a new test to define a new piece of functionality that will then allow us to go in and write other production code that will satisfy that test. So I've kind of been talking about this Java build script that we had. And we needed to build the Docker images for the Java build script. So in an afternoon, I decided, okay, I'm going to try this new approach. So I started about 12 o'clock, and I work until 4. What we did is we put the code into code jail. So we took that whole build script, and in Python it's white space aware, so we just indented it and wrapped it in a main function. And then we started writing the characterization tests around it. And during that time I thought, oh, here's a bug, but I resisted the urge at that point to change any code. All we did was say, this is how it currently functions. Regardless of whether it's right or wrong, there's tests around it. Once we did that, we went back in and we did a refactor, and then we added that new feature. So in the course of the afternoon, we put it into code jail. We wrote the characterization tests. We refactored some code, and we implemented the new feature for building a Docker image, so that we could deploy the Java artifacts as either a war or a jar or as a Docker image. And then we deployed that out, and we didn't have any of the issues. So comparing the two features, we did the first one, the Ruby build script, with a full rewrite, and that took us a total of 3 weeks to kind of to write it and then fix all the bugs that we introduced or that we missed, the missed requirements, versus the Java build script, which only took us an afternoon to put it into code jail, write those characterization tests, and add that new feature. And we didn't have any of the fallout that we had with the Ruby build script. So now a caveat there is that Java build script is still not perfect. It's still not gone through the full rewrite. It's not as what we would consider as pristine as the Ruby build script, but we were able to deliver business value in the course of an afternoon versus taking 3 weeks to really get to the same spot. So that was a huge plus for our team. But if we continue to make those 1% improvements on that Java build script, we can, after enough time, we'll be able to see that full 100% improvement that we're desiring. So that the case study. Oh, I apologize. So this is the process. I wasn't going through my slides here. We just took that build script, put it into a single function, wrote those characterization tests. We did the refactor and the new feature here. So then the next case study that I've got here is application deployment. So remember how I said that this Kaizen model can be applied to your function level, script level, application level, or infrastructure level. And this is the more the infrastructure level. So we had deployments, again, along the same lines. We had the Java deployments were done via wars, and they were deployed into a Tomcat container. And we wanted to start deploying those as Docker containers. So how do we apply this Kaizen model to application deployment? Well, first we put the application deployment into code jail. We isolated the current deployment and made no changes to it, so that the code that was going out was the same on both of those. And so now we have the old way of doing it and then the new way of doing it. We wrote characterization tests. We wrote some high-level API tests around that, treating the system as a black box. And we were able to call into the API and say, hey, if we call into the war deployed via a Tomcat container, does it give us the same response as the Docker container deployed? And that's how we kind of tested that. So you have to figure out what level your characterization tests are going to be at. And so we wrote those characterization tests and started executing them to make sure that the deployment of the Docker container was working the same as the war, the Tomcat container. And then finally, we started slowly migrating that traffic over and just kind of watching our monitoring and our system metrics to figure out, is this continuing to work the same? So are our tests sufficient to detect any issues in the system? And I'm happy to say that deployment went out successfully, and we were able to migrate all of our Java services over to the Docker containers. So what's another example of code jail? So that was at the infrastructure level. Then I was part of a team where we had applications, and they were written in Groovy, but we wanted to convert it over to Java. So how do you do that at the application level? So we decided that, and this was actually before I'd really kind of figured out what this system was, or defined the different steps in the system. But looking back on my time on that team, I realized that it followed the same sort of steps. So the application was written in Groovy, and we wanted to migrate that over to Java. So we just said, hey, put the whole application into code jail. There's no new changes going into this application during this period of time that we're doing the conversion. Then we wrote the characterization test, but in this case, we already had some amazing characterization tests around the application. We had API level tests around those services, defining the contracts that they were abiding by. So as we did the conversion from Groovy to Java, which was mainly removing all the closures and making that Java code, we were able to have the confidence that the API tests that we already had were written properly. We had a handful of service level unit tests in there, and we converted those over from Groovy to Java as well. But then the final step was the refactor, just turning that Groovy code into Java code. And so then at that point, we were satisfied that with the characterization test that our application was performing as we expected. So just to kind of recap, these were the three steps that we had were the code jail, the characterization tests, the refactor, or the new feature that we had. And this, again, can be applied at any level of your code, whether you want to do it at a single function level, or whether you want to do it at the script level, like we did, the application level, or the infrastructure level. And so now I've got time for questions. If anybody has questions about what we did, or examples of how you guys have done something similar. Yes, sir.
When you talk about putting code in code jail,
Yeah.
are you actually doing something to the repository, or is it just kind of communication with the team of like, hey, don't change the code?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I can repeat that. So as you're putting code into code jail, your question was, is there some sort of process, or are you just communicating across the team? Okay. Yeah, at that point, we just decided that we're going to communicate across the team and say, hey, we're going to do this, so let's not make changes at this point to the code base so that we can ensure the similarity between those two. So when we were doing the application deployment, we actually had two different branches that we were deploying. There was some application changes as we were doing that from a WAR to a Docker container, because they had to deploy it as a Spring Boot fat jar with embedded Tomcat. So they did have to cut a new branch, and we were deploying both of those branches. So we just said, hey, no new features, or if you're going to add new features, you have to make sure that it goes into both branches as we're doing those builds up through the environments. It's a great question. Yes, sir?
Have you found any ways or tools to automatically generate the characterization tests that you're talking about?
Yes, so your question was, have I found any tools to automatically generate those characterization tests? No, so a lot of times when you're writing these characterization tests, a lot of times it's against an untested code base. And so you're writing the test for the very first time. I'm not aware of any tools that write or just automatically generate those characterization tests. It just depends on what you're trying to test. You have to figure out what level. So are you talking like the API level, figuring out how you can generate those API level tests? Is that what you're talking about, or something else?
I realize there's a lot of different scenarios
Yeah.
you talked about, but
Yeah.
like thinking maybe more at the function level, like if you do something that's strongly typed, like you can almost fuzz it and see what the outcome is.
Yeah, so I'm not aware of anything at the function level or anything like that, but I'm sure there's tools out there. There might be tools out there that allow you to have that ability to kind of generate those tests on the fly. Yes, sir.
A couple of rewrite projects I've worked on have seen a benefit in a smaller scope of the final project. And so you mentioned like avoiding fixing a bug when you're at this characterization test phase. Would you do the same for features that you are pretty sure aren't being used anymore, or a feature that if you're going to rewrite from the ground up and kind of revisit that MVP concept,
Yeah.
and never rebuild again? Is that a part of that characterization part of it? Building tests around features that you might not want to see again? Or?
That's a good question. So I think if I can paraphrase what you're asking is, do you want to write characterization tests around potentially dead code? Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to do that? It depends what your risk tolerance is at that point. So I've been bitten by that a couple of times where I thought, oh, this is dead code, but I just didn't know how it was called. Or it was invoked from some other place that I didn't find the first time. So in my experience, I generally just say, it is what it is, and I'm going to write a test around that, and then later I'll go back and figure out, is this really dead code or not? So that's been my experience. Yes, sir?
What's been your experience
Missed requirements, yeah. So,
Sorry, not a missed test, I guess, not a missed requirement, but a missed test. Like this thing was doing this, but
yeah,
nobody saw it.
right. So, great question. So, how do I go back and write that missed test for that application or that script? So, the Ruby build script, we missed a couple of requirements. It was kind of nested in a function, and we didn't see that branching logic. So we just went back and just said, hey, if you encounter this scenario, we wrote that next test that just said, again, it's just kind of test-driven development. We just wrote that next test that said, hey, if you encounter this scenario, it should do this thing. And we saw the failing test. And then we just went back and re-implemented that missed feature that that didn't get ported during that rewrite. And that allowed us to just kind of move forward then and make sure that both the existing applications and both scenarios of that build script were satisfied. Does that make sense? Or did that answer your question or not?
Not exactly.
Okay.
I guess what I'm thinking of more is when you hit step 3 under your refactoring, you miss something in code jail. So how bad is that? You know what I mean? I don't know that it's sort of even using this, but
Yeah, so you're right. So since you're not doing true test-driven development, because you've already got all the production code there and missing that test, so if you're doing that, if you're just practicing these 3 steps and you've got this stuff in code jail, you've got the characterization test, and then you go to add that new feature, the test may not have been exhaustive the first time. Is that kind of what you're saying? Yeah. At that point, you just kind of go back and just say, okay, well, I missed something here. I should have a failing test, but I don't. So let's go back and rewrite that test, and then just make sure that it can get through and pass. Yes, sir.
In doing this before with the project, we used coverage tools.
Mm-hmm.
To just validate the characterization tests are covering all the stuff expected to. Find stuff that's not, go back and figure out what the rest of it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So you've done this process, you have the 1% fixed. How do you, A, get time to do the rest, or B, do you convince other people that you should do it versus just letting it sit there now in the 1% better state?
Good question. So as you're working on this and you're improving at 1% every single day, how do you continue to make those 1% improvements?
Yeah, how do you get time to do it? Because you've already fixed it and your manager says, hey, it's better now.
Yeah, that's a good question. So hopefully during that second step, when you're writing those characterization tests, that you've written enough characterization tests that the next person that comes along has the confidence to be able to refactor the code. And so I would love to stand up here and say that Java build script has gone through the full rewrite that I initially had envisioned. It hasn't yet, but we've got a good test suite around that. So next time we go in there and make a tweak, or as I get time to go in there and refactor, we'll be able to make those changes with confidence. And so I guess just kind of building that in and just saying, hey, we have like a 5% time that we get Friday afternoons. We get to work on things, and so I'll take some of my time and say, hey, I'm going to go refactor this, or kind of clean that up and figure out how I can make it look more like that Ruby build script. Yes, sir.
So I was curious if there's more of a serious commitment to paying down technical debt with the debt metaphor at Dave Ramsey Company.
Yeah. So your question is there a commitment to paying down technical debt?
Does the metaphor stick and resonate because of the nature of the business?
Yes.
So you call it debt, and then people are, the whole point is to get rid of debt, right?
Yes, sir.
Does that resonate? Does that help you, or does that hurt you when we're talking about technical issues, complexity, and technical debt?
Yeah, so to just paraphrase your question for everybody, so I work at Ramsey Solutions, which is the Dave Ramsey company. He's got the Dave Ramsey Show, and he talks about personal debt. And is that metaphor for debt translate into the technical world? And it definitely does. We had our senior technology officer really explained it to him like, hey, technical debt, this is what we're dragging along. He's like, wow, that makes sense. Let's pay that down. So Ramsey Solutions has a lot of cold fusion code, and we're kind of following this process as we retire all of our old code fusion code, and we're doing Java services on the back end and Ruby on Rails on the front end. We pick off, as a systems team, we're picking off routes at a time. We just say, hey, here's a route. Let's rewrite that in Ruby on Rails, and then we'll just migrate all the traffic for that single route over. So we are actively retiring all of our technical debt and trying to get off of some of that stuff. So it's nice that we work at a place that really sees that and encourages that. Yes, sir.
Do you give yourself time frames for how long something could be in code jail or how long a refactor or a feature could be? So your example is talk about 3 whole weeks to completely rewrite something versus 4 hours for an afternoon. So do you set a time limit or some sort of limit for how long it can be in between those steps before you back it out or do something else?
That's a good question. So, is there a time frame that we self-impose on any one of those 3 steps: code jail, characterization test, or refactor new feature? For me, it's just how fast can I deliver that business value? Well, as a professional, ensuring that the quality of the code is going to be there, that the confidence for refactoring and for my fellow developers that as they come along, that they're going to have the confidence to be able to come in and help maintain that code or add new features to that code. For me, it's just how quickly can I add that? So the afternoon, I kind of sat down and said, I think I can do this in an afternoon, and I was able to achieve that. And to me, it's just how I do try and give myself time boxes. I don't think on the code jail, putting it in there or whatever, once you put it into code jail, it just kind of goes into code jail, right? And until you have that, to me, it should stay in code jail until you have the sufficient characterization tests around it to start to refactor. So maybe put a section into code jail. Like I said, it could be applied at the method level. You say, this method is doing and delegating. It's doing way too many things. So let's, if we can, isolate it and just say, that single function, can we get tests around that function, and then we can start to refactor it out as we need, or at the script level. It's just how big and what level do you want to write those characterization tests?
Just kind of the thought of, you think it's going to take you 3 weeks to do a specific thing, like maybe bit off too big of a chunk, you should try to do a smaller piece of that.
Yeah, and so if, like you said, if you think it's going to take you 3 weeks, or you start getting into it and it's going to take longer than you initially thought, just backing that out. I've actually there's one script in there that I've tried a couple different times to try and get into code jail, trying to get some characterization tests around, and after an hour, I just like, oh, this is a lot bigger than I thought, and so I just throw that work away. I'm just like, I don't know if this is going to be valuable later, so I just kind of threw it away, and that was okay at the time. Eventually, we'll get to that, and we'll be able to put it in. We'll truly put that into code jail. We'll get those characterization tests around it, and then we'll be able to refactor that really important script as we need to. But right now, it's been stable. It just doesn't have any tests around it, and so that makes me nervous to go add any new features or to refactor it. So until I can do that, I'm going to try and avoid that script as much as possible. So it's really just balancing that business value with paying down that technical debt. Yeah.
So do you use GitHub Flow or GitFlow when you're doing this and do a branch just for your characterization tests? It's like code jail, that kind of seems to me almost like code freeze, where that can become a blocker to continuous deployment. So when you're working on that code, especially as you get to a team of 15, 20 developers working in the same code base, how do you do the code jail without, say there's a bug in there, and you're trying to figure out how to refactor it. Maybe it'll fix the bug with the refactor, but they're trying to fix the P1 production issue. Do you do that on a branch, or are you working on master and kind of just telling everybody, hey, hands off unless it's a P1?
That's a good question. So the question, if I can repeat that, was, do you use a Git workflow to kind of go through the different steps? Do you use a branching logic to put it into code jail, write the characterization testing, then get it back into master, right? Yeah, so that's a great question. I think putting your code into code jail should be pretty simple. That should go straight onto master, whether that's just isolated inside of a single function like we did here. I put that into a function, merge that back into master, because that should have had it didn't have any impact on the build script. But then if anybody else needed to make changes to that, for whatever reason, they would have my changes. And then as you're writing those characterization tests, then everybody's working off of the same thing, right? So if you kind of establish that boundary of saying, hey, we're going to do this, now we can start to make that better, type of thing. Yeah, good question. Yes, sir.
Any suggestions or thought if this could be adopted or adapted to support one of 3 major situations? An underlying infrastructure upgrade. You're shifting from one OS platform to another. You're upgrading the database version. You're moving to AWS. Or another instance, if you've got purchased software which has been surrounded by in-house developed software and routines, and you're going to now have a third the third-party application says, we've got a major new application. Could you use something like this to assist, make it go faster, get better quality?
Yeah, so if I can repeat that question, I think what you said was, can we use this at the infrastructure level with either third-party software or our own software? Is that correct? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, like I described, we actually had that where we were doing different deployments, right, for our own software. We had them cut a different branch to say, hey, we're going to build this over here as a Docker image, and over here we're going to continue to build it as a WAR. And we did both deployments in parallel. And we did the API level test, the characterization test around both of those to say, hey, they're giving us back the same thing. We just ran that test suite against both of them to make sure that the returned value was what we expected. We've done this with self-hosted infrastructure. We've deployed on our self-hosted infrastructure, but then we also move it to AWS, and we've kind of done that same thing. Run the API level test against it, make sure that it's giving us back the same contract, and that's been successful for us. So I think that you can do that, and just kind of putting that code freeze around the existing infrastructure, building up your other infrastructure side by side, and that could be argued as like a blue-green deployment type of a thing. So that's been, I've seen that work, yes, sir. And I think that's our time. So if you guys have any more questions, feel free to hit me up afterwards. This was a great conversation. So thanks, guys.